The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
Khloe Kardashian went viral when she talked about she went to pick up her baby who was born via surrogate, that it felt very strange and transactional when this woman who just had her baby handed her the baby, and when Khloe walks into the other room to hold the baby. Now, most people never talked about the realities of surrogacy, but I'm really glad that she is, because this is such an important conversation. Most people don't really understand why surrogacy is a bad thing, so I'm going to tell you why it's not something that we should be supporting. Research says that there is a primal wound when a child is separated from their mother at birth. So in adoption, we see this happening. People who have been adopted have these traumatic wounds from, even if they were adopted at birth, there is still a trauma of separation that happens there. And the reality is that everybody wants to know biologically who they are. If you look at research, you'll find that those who have been adopted and don't know their families do want to know, who do they look like? Where did their traits come from? Like, why are they the way they are? Like, whose eyes did they have? Whose nose did they have? You can have the most wonderful parents in the world, but that doesn't stop the curiosity and the desire to know who they are. And while adoption is a wonderful thing and it is a solution, surrogacy is the situation where they actually create this primal wound. Like, you are literally creating a human being, knowing that you are going to impart trauma on them from the moment that they are born. Like, we don't even separate puppies from their mother for 6 weeks, and yet with these surrogate babies, we are literally just taking them away from the only bodies that they've ever known and handing them off to someone else. Why do we do this? We do this so that adults that want a baby can have a baby. In these situations, no one is configuring the experiences and the rights of the child that's been created. Many times these children are created to go to families where they aren't going to have a mom and a dad. When we talk about the basic rights of children, all children should have the right to a mom and dad. They're going to turn out horrible, or that life is going to be awful. If they don't, it doesn't mean that single parents or gay parents aren't awesome parents that grow up with a mom and a dad, especially if they're married, do better in life statistically in general. Surrogacy is all about selfish adult desires and has no regard for the experience and the traumas that the child is going to face because of it. Even support groups that have started up for people that have been born from surrogacy and sperm donation and all of that. Things are only getting worse in this department, and we need more awareness about why surrogacy is not good for humans.
All right, Joshua, we're going to try this one more time.
Dude, it's so technology, man.
Technology is wonderful and awful all at the same time. And for everybody out there that deals with technology, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But Joshua, how's it going, man?
It's good, dude. We're got a nice sunny day. Hurricane in Florida, you know.
For real.
When I hate the weather in Tennessee, I just say I don't have hurricanes, I don't have blizzards.
It's true.
A few tornadoes, but it'll be all right.
I'm curious. My wife is supposed to be leaving for Florida next week, so I'm curious to see how all this goes down with her. But you're right, man. The weather has cooled off for us up here. Super excited about that. Best time of the year. If you're watching this recording the day it comes out, tomorrow Tennessee football is back.
Bring it on.
Could not be more stoked, right?
Yep.
Could not be more excited about Tennessee football. But before we get to all that, Joshua, we have a really interesting topic. I don't know how else to describe it, right? Interesting.
That's the only way you can describe it.
Man, I am telling you. But guys, welcome back. This is your Content Warning, a Bible Meets Culture podcast where we break down biblical content versus modern theology. And Joshua, we're talking about a topic today that I think a lot of people watching this might be thinking about for possibly the first time. We talked about this before we started recording, right? This is something that generally, I don't know if too many Christians think about this until they have to.
Right. Yeah, I think most of us have this idea in our minds, and it's kind of ingrained in us as kids or teenagers, that you're going to meet the love of your life and you'll date for a year or so, and then you'll get married, and you'll be married for 3 to 5 years, and then you'll have, 2 or 3 kids, and they'll all be healthy and happy, and you won't have any problems with reproduction or anything like that, and that everything's going to work out fine. And the chances of that happening for most people are relatively high, but always that one chance where the guy meets girl and they get married and realize that they can't have children maybe on their own, or something physically might not be right with one of them, and so they look to other means. And the question for us today is one of these means that we discussed in the video something that is morally, ethically, and godly?
Sure,
Right.
absolutely. And it's funny you say that, right? Because we grow up and we just kind of assume that everything's going to work out the way that we think it's going to work out, and in the
Yeah.
event that we're ever told that things aren't going to work out, generally you hear the what I'm going to call the medical miracle stories, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
girl who went into menopause when she was 21 and ended up getting pregnant when she was 27, while they're going, people who struggle for years and years and years to find out that, his sperm count is zero. So they start the adoption process and all of a sudden they get pregnant. Like we
Yep.
hear those stories.
Yep.
But I don't know that we ever talk about or think about or hear a lot of the people that had to go through the entire process, right? I
Right.
mean, you hear the good stories. We don't talk or think about this a whole lot. And for those of you that are still in the dark because you either didn't watch the intro video or you haven't seen the title of this video or you're just really confused, we're talking about things like surrogacy, adoption, and IVF, right? I mean, this is the video that comes to us, brought to us by her. I think her handle is Cool Church Girl, which we'll talk about why we got a slight problem with that in a little bit. But woman's name is Miss Erica Anderson. The reason I have a problem with that particular handle, this idea of being the cool church girl, is she stands on this and she presents this in a way that this should be and sometimes is the universal Christian stance on these particular topics. And if you watch that video, you'll know she's very against surrogacy. Not as much hit on in this video about adoption and IVF, but surrogacy, she says, is a huge thing that she claims Christians should not support in any way, form, or fashion. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But just Joshua, give me your initial thoughts, man. I mean, like she threw a lot of info. We got a lot of things to get to, but I want to know kind of what you thought right off the bat of this.
Yeah. So, we all have presuppositions about certain things, and I don't know if you want to talk about this more later on, but for Faulkner, I taught a class called Christian Ethics where we do talk about surrogate motherhood quite extensively. And you and I have a mutual friend. I won't mention her name, but she's worked as a surrogate mother, and I interviewed her for that class and made my students watch it. And to be honest with you, I go back and forth as to what I believe about the morality of surrogate motherhood. I want to agree with it. I want to think that it is a good and moral thing for someone to do to bring a life into this world when that process might be difficult.
Sure,
But I do worry about what I call the third party issue, which is
sure,
bringing a third party into the relationship to bring
right.
about a child. As far as
Excluding the physician, right?
what'd you say?
Yeah, excluding a physician,
Right. Yeah. Excluding the physician, sure, because that's
right?
obviously a third party. But um, general thoughts. I thought what she had to say was something worth thinking about.
Sure,
She raised some really good points. I'm not entirely convinced by her whole trauma spiel. And part of that is because I think that there's a general mentality in a modern, call it American life,
right,
where if you want to argue against something, you say it's traumatic to somebody
right.
else.
We'll
And
get
that
to
may or
that
may
in a
not
little
be
bit.
true. Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll get to that later.
we'll
But
talk to that about to that extent in just a minute because there is some evidence to suggest stuff like that. But anyway,
sure,
sorry, go ahead.
sure. The other thing that I thought was kind of thought provoking was the deal about calling it selfish.
Mm,
And I'm not entirely convinced that anyone who does this does it out of selfish desire.
sure,
In fact, I think most of those who work as surrogates would say that it is a selfless thing to put your
sure.
body through all that stuff. So, yeah, we were talking about it a lot before we started recording. We got a lot to talk about with this video. But overall, general thoughts. Um, it's kind of like the seesaw. I go
Yeah.
up and down with it.
Well, so I'm right there with you, man. It's one of those things. We said it, like I said before we started this. It's one of those things that it's topics that we don't really consider until we have to, and then
Yep.
some of us, at least for myself and my wife, we have two boys. We never had any trouble getting pregnant. We did go through one miscarriage, which doctors kind of attributed to us not waiting long enough from a removal of birth control, that they kind of attributed that to. But I think a lot of Christians, when they think about this topic, it's hard for them to wrap their mind around either end of it, right?
Mm.
Because for a lot of Christians, this comes up and it doesn't have any real impact on their life, right? You ask, if you talk to like maybe my parents, right? Both my parents in their mid 50s, two sons, they're never had to consider any of that stuff, and they're both on and enjoying grandparent life now, honestly.
Right.
Um, but when I watch the video, I can understand why, if you are pro surrogacy, this video would have made you mad. And I can understand where, if you're anti surrogacy, you're probably cheering right along with her. And I can
Right.
understand why, if you're on the fence, this video is probably incredibly thought provoking to you.
Yes.
And so, like, I get that, and I see that, and I definitely want to kind of go through some of the claims that she makes through this video as to why she's so anti surrogacy. And we're going to start with the very first one, right? The very first thing that she mentions, the reason that she claims all Christians should be against surrogacy is the idea that it is traumatic for the child. And she'll go so on as to say, and we'll get to a little bit more of these later, but later in the video, she makes the comment of, this is intentional and forced trauma on a baby. And she mentioned something, because I did way more research on this than I probably should have, but she mentioned something called primal wound trauma. So primal wound trauma, for those of you that are unaware, like I was when I first watched this video, so I had to go looking. Primal wound trauma comes from a theory. It's literally just a theory. There's been relatively little scholarly work done in this area, right? This theory was from a book called The Primal Wound Theory. It was published in 1993. It's the only edition of that book that's ever been released. It was written by a woman named Nancy Veier, Veier, for anybody that wants to go read and look into that. And it talks about the psychological, physiological, emotional, hormonal wound that is created when you physically separate a newborn child from their birth mother. And so her big argument is that, why would you willingly put a child through this sort of traumatic experience? Josh, I'm kind of with you. I think that trauma has become such a hot button topic that it's kind of almost lost meaning as far as what it actually is and entails in a lot of scenarios. But that's her first thing that she kind of brings up. Ironically, she says once in the video that you see primal wound trauma with adoption, but then she later goes on to say that adoption is a wonderful thing. And so, whereas you're okay with trauma in one sense, you're not okay with trauma in another. And so that one was a little bit confusing to me as well. But let me know what you think about that. And then I've got some kind of notes down here of primal wound trauma just in general on the topic. But I was curious what your thoughts were on traumatic experiences for the child.
Well, life is full of traumatic experiences, and I don't mean to lessen any of those experiences, but every child is going to have a traumatic experience at one point or another in his or her life. And I'm not entirely convinced that a newborn baby being taken out of a surrogate's womb and handed to birth parents, or handed to the
Mhm.
biological parents, let's say the
Right.
biological genetic material parents, is going to cause as much of a trauma as these people argue. I think about adoption too, and you brought up adoption. I'm not going to talk
Sure.
about adoption very much, but so I have a set of cousins who I think have two adopt. I know one of them is adopted. I think the other one's adopted as well. Adopted children, and they were both adopted as babies
Yeah.
there in the hospital, and so they had a woman who got pregnant. She didn't want to keep the child, and they talked with this woman through the adoption agency and
Yeah.
have a good relationship with her. And the woman signed over the rights of the child. So they were there in the hospital room when the child was born, and that child was taken from that mother
Sure.
and given to my cousins.
Yeah.
And then that mother, after she was well enough to go home, went home, and
Right.
my cousins stayed at the hospital, as if they had birthed the child
Right.
themselves. So what's the difference there?
Yeah.
The difference is the genetic material. And so I don't think the trauma, or whatever you want to call it, is the issue. For me, the issue is, how do you define motherhood? And we can
Sure.
talk about that later, because you have more to say about the trauma stuff here.
Sure. No, you're good. So I'm with you, right? So my big question is, where do you draw that line? Where do you draw that line on what is and what isn't a traumatic enough of experience for a newborn infant for you to decide something is or isn't morally ethical?
Hmm.
Right? Because you see that in adoption all the time. And she brings it up that even adopted at newborn infants have traces of what we call primal wound trauma. And so, interestingly enough, when you go and you look through scholarly evidences on this particular topic, there is nothing definitive on it whatsoever.
Hmm.
There is a lot of evidence that would support the idea that, look, being separated from your parent at birth is a traumatic experience, but even that gets argued over.
Hmm.
And so, one thing you have to remember too is birth, in and of itself, for a child, is a very traumatic experience.
Sure.
They are being removed from the only environment they've ever known and being thrust into a brand new world full of loud noises, bright lights, like just all sorts of things that are completely overwhelming to them. So it's
Hmm.
traumatic in and of itself. So is birth then considered morally unethical? Because that's a willing imposed trauma on a child.
Sure.
Even those that have written, nearly all scholars, and even Nancy says herself, they suggest that the only way that somebody, an infant, can become a fully functioning independent person is to grieve the primal wound trauma, but not root their identity in it. So, whether you're talking about adoption or surrogacy, everybody suggests that even though it may cause trauma, you're not going to become a very well functioning individual if that's what you root your identity in. And that spans, I guess you could say that encompasses more than just surrogacy, right?
Sure.
If an adopt it's the same reason that you have surrogate children or IVF children or adopted children. Some will grow up and be what society, what we refer to as problem kids, right?
Mm.
Those that grew up who really had a problem with the fact that they were adopted. They don't know why their parents gave them up, and they hang on to that their whole life, and they cause trouble because of it. And you have some that grow up who are adopted who live fully formed, functioning lives, and you would never know that these people had been adopted at birth or teens, whatever.
Right.
It's because some choose to root their identity in that, and others choose to root their identity in who their family is. And I
Yeah.
think there's a
And
big distinction in that.
I think that's more of a reflection on the parents
Sure.
than the child. I have seen a lot of adopted children go on to become amazing, phenomenal people, like
Absolutely.
good, godly Christian people, morally upright people. You and I have a mutual friend. I'm not going to say his name. I might tell you after the podcast who I'm thinking of, but
I got you.
he is one of the best people I've ever met, and he's adopted. He and
Yeah.
his adopted parents aren't even the same race,
Yeah.
and he is one of the most amazing people I've ever met.
Sure.
On the other hand, I've met people who are biological children of their parents, and their parents are god awful, and
Right.
they grow up to be absolute. Now, I'm not saying that it's all nature
Sure.
versus nurture or whatever, or vice versa, but I think that is a reflection on the parents too.
Sure. Both things have their place. And so I
Sure.
guess my thing is with the trauma, she wants to make the comment that no Christian should willingly want to impose that sort of trauma on a child. Well, I mean, how about dedicating your entire life to making sure that a child's identity is rooted in Christ as opposed to a trauma,
Right.
regardless of if it's surrogacy, adoption, birth, or something else, right? And so I just don't know that the trauma argument is enough for me to go, no, I think you're right. That's morally a bad idea. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. Let me say this too before we move on.
Sure.
You're not to bring abortion into it, but I think there's a parallel
Sure.
here. Um, when people talk about abortion, they typically say abortion is wrong except in cases of incest and rape.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
I'm only talking about this for an illustrative purpose.
No, I got you.
Um, the problem with that is how that life came into being does not lessen the reality that that is a life,
Or the value
okay?
that it has.
Or the value of the life for sure.
Sure.
I bring that up because with surrogacy, as this woman in the video is suggesting, that it's traumatic and therefore, it shouldn't happen. Well, the formation of life is still happening.
Hmm.
And so that life still has to be something created in the image of God with intrinsic value.
Right.
So we're not necessarily talking here about the creation of life. We're talking about how the life was created.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true in the discussions of abortion. People say, well, it's how it was, how the life was created dictates whether or not you can abort. No, it doesn't. No,
Yeah.
it doesn't. And I think the same is true with surrogacy.
I got you. Well, so that kind of leads us into something else a little bit there, because she makes the comment that another big reason that you shouldn't go through with surrogacy is that people have or want to know, like deep down, they have this natural inclination or desire to know biologically who they are,
Mm.
right? And so when you go through surrogacy or adoption or IVF or something like that, when you grow up, right, with parents that go, you all don't look like me, right? Whether it's a skin color, eye color, attached or detached earlobes, widow's peak, whatever you want to throw out there.
Mm.
She claims that I guess this would, I don't know if this would fall more under the trauma or the identity or both, right? But you've got this idea of you're placing kids in an environment where they're going to spend their whole life not knowing something they want to know, potentially, right? Depending on what the legalities are around your surrogacy or adoption or whatever.
Mhm.
I know adoption has a lot more options to it than surrogacy. Generally, with surrogacy, there is no known desire of the surrogate mother whatsoever on either party's end, and that's kind of all agreed to up front, which we'll get to in a little bit. Um, but I think that falls back to Joshua, the identity problem or process that you go through. Right, you can know biologically who you are, but biology makes you who you are, but it doesn't necessarily make you who you are. Does that make sense? I know that like for us, that kind of makes sense. If you're listening, this might be really confusing. But your DNA does not determine the character of a person, right? Your DNA does not determine who you grow up to be. Your
Right.
DNA determines your eye color, your hair color, your whether or not you're going to end up having a bunch of back hair when you're 40, 50 years old. But it doesn't determine who you are. And so, whereas there could be an urge to know biologically, where look, I grew up with two parents that one grew up with blonde hair that turned into brown hair, the other one jet black her whole life. My brother and I both have red hair, both have no clue where it came from, right? And it's just a big, long running joke, has been for the last nearly 30 years of my life, that we still have no idea where mine and my brother's hair color came from. Zero whatsoever. But we know better. Like it's just a physical characteristic of us, right? So just because people want to know biologically why they are or who they are or what they look like doesn't mean one, you'll ever get answers, and two, it doesn't change who they are as a person.
Well, we live in such a world where your physical attributes is your identity. You
Sure.
know, and I want to be sensitive in saying this, but why is it that teenage girls run off and dye their hair blue? Why do teenage guys?
For that matter, I don't know if you knew that's a new fad for
What's
teenage girls
that?
to dye their hair. Teenage girls dye their hair gray now
Yeah, I
for
saw
whatever
that.
reason.
Yeah,
40 and 50-year-old women who have spent their whole lives trying to cover up their gray, and you've got 18-year-olds now that think gray hair is cool. So I
well,
don't know.
well,
Have
the
to ask
same
somebody.
the same is true for men.
Sure.
Men of any age will go out and alter their identity, and you see this more and more with the racial divide. Being being proud of your ethnic heritage, whatever that is, and I even see it in more and more now among white people, for lack of a better term. It's like you're not white, you're
Yeah.
you're British or you're Irish or you're
Right.
Scottish or you're whatever,
Yeah.
and everything about who you are is rooted in your ancestry from
Sure.
an ethnic standpoint.
Sure.
And I
I mean, that's why you've seen the explosion of things like the was it 23andMe and
sure,
Ancestry.com and stuff like
yeah,
that. We all want to know where we came from, so to
yeah.
speak, right? That's interesting. But again, Josh, I think the point you're hitting at is we're seeing more and more and more people root their identity in where they came from
Right.
or
Well, we're
what
trying we're
their
rooting
DNA.
our identity in the physical and carnal,
Sure.
rather than in the spiritual and
Right.
mental, like the character of your heart. From a Christian perspective, we're created in the image of God, children of God if we're in Christ.
Sure.
That's our identity. God is our heavenly Father, and we have that connection as well. Um, and so th- I think the desire to know who you are is easily answered.
Hmm.
You know, you, you don't have to be to want to know who you are does not necessarily mean that you have to figure out who your ancestry is.
Well, so here's the other part of that too that I kind of want to piggyback on this because I think I get where you're going, but I also want to ask too because I think we're conflating something that doesn't necessarily need to be pulled out of context. Why is that a bad thing? Right?
Right.
Why is it a bad thing the way that she proposes this? Why is it a bad thing to want to know why you look the way you look?
Hmm.
Why is it a bad thing to want to have a biological desire to know, why I'm made up the way I'm made up? I would
But
argue there's nothing wrong with that until it becomes that obsessive identity, right?
yeah,
And you're pulling yourself away from. And I guess, again, this is me just kind of thinking out loud. I guess that her argument would be because I don't think I've watched several of her videos. I know that she would not argue against wanting children to root their identity in Christ, right?
sure.
She posts tons and tons of videos about trying to raise her children that way. And so I guess the argument would be, are you creating an environment where somebody is going to be more focused on that than where they are? And again, I think that kind of falls back to the parenting thing, but we'll.
But this is a misrepresentation of the argument from surrogacy. Now, I can understand adoption having this argument
Sure.
or something like that. The child of a surrogate is
Sure.
genetically matched to the mother and father, and not genetically matched to the surrogate, even though the
Sure.
surrogate is the one carrying it. And so to say, well, I want to know where I came from. Well, the answer is still you came from your mom and your dad.
Sure.
You have their genetic makeup, you have their ancestry. You could be a Caucasian baby that was in an African American
Sure.
womb, and you're still going to be a Caucasian baby with the
Yeah.
genetic makeup. And so I don't think that's a good argument
No.
against surrogacy to be like, well, they're going to want to know where they came from. Well, that's where they came from.
Yeah. Not unless, put it this way, not unless she's trying to attach that part to the trauma, right?
Yep.
The if she's trying to attach the biological desire to uh, I guess lasting trauma from having a desire to know who you are, and that being caused by a separation of the womb and you at birth or whatever. But again, I don't know that that tracks, right? Again, it's not enough for me
But
to go, well, again, there's nothing wrong with wanting to know that. And again, biologically speaking, you are who you are, even through surrogacy,
right,
right? It would be more of an argument from adoption, and it's something that for people who have ever gone through adoption, um, from a parent's perspective, there are hundreds of thousands of resources on how to address and parent that specific issue.
right,
What do I do when my kid wants to know biologically who do they belong to?
right.
And how do I lead them and parent them in an identity and where they are now versus where they came from?
Yeah, but from my perspective, if you want to make a trauma argument against
Sure.
surrogacy, to me, the better argument would be trauma from the perspective of the surrogate, from the
Absolutely.
woman. Because
Absolutely.
you and I talked about this before the podcast. When you give birth, a
Sure.
hormone is released
Yep.
that makes you, you know, love and care for that child. And we talked beforehand about our mutual friend, and
Yeah.
uh, she mentioned to me when I interviewed her for my Christian ethics class about having to go through all kinds of counseling even before she even got the embryo,
Right.
while she was pregnant, going through counseling to make sure that when she gave birth that she would be willing to give up that child. There were legal documents that said if you try to keep the child, we can sue you for everything that you
Right.
have. I mean, that to me, that's the traumatic part.
Absolutely. 100%. I'm 100% with you on that. when you talk about, and again, now maybe that's the better argument, right? Maybe the better
No.
argument is, well, I don't want to put somebody else through the trauma of giving birth to a child and having that child taken away from them,
Yeah.
right? Even though biologically she has no connection to it whatsoever,
Right.
other than the fact that she carried it,
Yeah.
right? So we'll have to forgive me if you're watching this and you're a medical professional if I'm misusing the term biological, right? Because I would assume that there's some sort of biological connection when you're carrying a child in your womb, despite the fact that the DNA makeup has nothing to do with you. Maybe that's
Yeah.
a better way to phrase
Well, I
that.
mean, you have the what do you call it? The embryonic sac, the
Right.
placenta, the umbilical cord. All of
Sure.
that comes from
The
your
surrogate.
yeah, from the
Yeah.
surrogate. And so there is a biological connection, even though it's not
Right.
DNA. But to
Sure.
me, this may be a good time to bring this up. It,
Yeah. Go
it's
for
the,
it.
it's the question of motherhood. How do
Yeah.
you define motherhood? Because if motherhood is only defined by the one who birthed the child,
Right.
then the surrogate would be the mother. If it's only defined by the one who raises the child,
Right.
then the adopted mother, in the case of adoption, would be the mother, or
Sure.
the whoever the female is who raises the child would be the mother.
Or like so grandparents, right?
Mm.
Like a kid that has to be raised by a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle
Right,
or
right.
friends of said family that have no connection, whatever that case may be.
Right.
It's I think it's interesting, Joshua, that you bring that up because I think that it has to be a really important distinction, not just here, but in I think really every area when it comes to parenthood in general. I've got really really close friends in some of my friend circles that guy I'm not gonna, won't tell you his name obviously, but he doesn't believe that he is qualified to serve as a shepherd in the Lord's church because his child is adopted. And
Interesting.
like I
Interesting.
said, that's one of those things. Now, I don't have to agree with that view, and that's
Sure.
maybe a podcast for another time. But it's a big question that I think a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And so, but I'm with you, right? What constitutes being a mother to somebody, right?
Yeah.
And whichever term you like to use, right? You always hear the expression that that person might have been your dad, but he wasn't your father, or vice versa, right?
Right.
Biologically, that person might have been your father, but he wasn't your dad, right? He's
Yeah.
not the guy that you tell Happy Father's Day to, just because, And so I tell people all the time that you're singularly speaking, your ability to procreate um, does not entitle you to being a parent or even a successful parent, much less just a parent, right?
Sure. And I do think it's interesting that the term mother is attached to surrogate. When you talk about surrogate, you talk about surrogate motherhood, or she's
Yeah,
the surrogate mother. And then you have the biological mother
yeah,
on the other hand, right? So in both cases, the word is attached, but in totally different contexts.
yeah. I got you. Well, okay, so let's talk about this then, because we've been talking a lot about the mother, which I think is interesting because the next argument she makes is that in surrogacy, and this I'll just go ahead and tell you, Joshua. I think this is her worst argument.
Mm.
We're gonna go with her worst argument, and then I'll end with what I think is her best argument. But her worst argument by far to me is throughout this entire process, she says nobody is considering the child. Nobody's considering the trauma that they put on the child. Nobody is considering the fact that they're ripping a child away. Now, she does reference in the video, and anybody who wants to can go and she talks about one of the Kardashians who did this via surrogate,
Yeah.
right? And she says in the interview that the whole process felt incredibly transactional. And I'm sure that there's probably a lot of people who feel that way when it comes to surrogacy that have been through that process because it can, if there's no, like, if you haven't carried said child, it can feel like, a transaction process. Um, but again, she claims that everybody's more focused on the parents and nobody's focused on the child, which I could not adamantly disagree with more.
Right.
When it comes to the safety and the well being of the child, surrogacy is one of the most lengthy processes you can go through in order to obtain like obtain sounds like a transactional word, but in order to obtain a child, um, unless you're going through like a wait list adoption type process, surrogacy is one of the most lengthy processes because you have to be matched up with the correct mother. You have to go through all the medical paperwork, all the mental paperwork, all the legal paperwork. You have to, I mean, the process and the links that we go to make sure that beyond a shadow of a doubt that the child will be safe, healthy, and taken care of from the point of fertilization to the placement with the biological parents is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
In a good way, right? I mean, you could not go through any more links. It doesn't feel like when you look through a step by step breakdown of what the surrogacy process is, of making sure the child is going to have the best possible outcome. So from step one to taking the baby home, I would argue that nobody thinks. I'm trying to think. Nobody considers anything more than the child.
Right.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And the transactional thing, again, maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but I I do not agree with surrogacy as a profession.
Sure.
I don't think that it is morally right for someone to have money paid to them for the purpose of carrying another human.
Like
And there are
rent a
people,
room system.
yeah, rent-a-wombs is what. So I got that from the book
Yeah.
Moral Choices. It's written by Scott Ray.
Yeah.
Dr. Ray is he's a theologian. It's a book called Moral Choices, but he worked for a hospital as their ethical advisor, and so he knows what he's doing, especially in medical ethics. And
Sure.
he called them rent-a-wombs, and I think that's a really good term because these
Really.
people,
It's exactly what it is.
they meet for 9 months during the gestational period. Once the
Yep.
baby's born, you pay your money and
Yep.
you're done.
Yeah.
I think there's a real difference between that and someone saying, "Hey, I don't have the physical capabilities of having a child, but my
Sure.
sister does, and we're gonna donate eggs and do
Sure.
IVF, and then she'll carry the baby, and we'll not have a transactional thing. We'll obviously pay for the medical bills and stuff, but we're not paying her for her services
Right.
of carrying the child." I think there is a big difference there, and our
Sure.
listeners are probably disagreeing right now, but that's okay. You're entitled to disagree.
Absolutely.
But yes, I certainly. I mean, there's a lot of danger that goes into doing these medical practices,
Mhm.
and it is interesting from my perspective that medical professionals who deal with surrogacy and who deal with the embryo in particular in IVF and the creation of the embryo and all of that, they're wanting to preserve the life of the embryo.
Sure.
And then you get the abortion argument that says that's not even a life.
Right.
Well, I think to those professionals and to the parents and the surrogate involved, yeah, that is a life, and it's a life worthy of being cared for and
Sure.
nurtured and
Yeah.
protected. Um, yeah, I think you're on the money, Nathan. That was
Yeah.
the worst argument that
Well,
she
and like,
ever had.
yeah, it just it boils down to, and again, you could, if you're going to try to make that argument that nobody's concerned with the child, right? Well, you're concerned about the mental paperwork and the legal paperwork because the hospitals and everybody involved is only concerned with themselves, right? You're concerned about the physicals because you're just doing one of those things that. What's up, Chris? How are you?
All right.
I'm recording a podcast. Would you like to come join me? No. Chris is our local medical professional here, by the way. We're talking about surrogacy, so.
Oh, dude, come on.
He was more, you were more surgeon though, right? You didn't deal with a lot of surrogacy cases.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyway, what's up?
Nothing. I came over here to help me to pack some match out boxes.
Sounds exciting.
165.
Sounds exciting.
So I'll shut the door.
Hi, you're good.
It would have been cool for him to come in and talk, though.
I was about to say you never know what's gonna happen during the middle of one of these, so that'll be a lot of fun. But But yeah, the reason that we put so much time and effort into surrogacy, and the reason that it's such a long process, is simply because everybody wants what's best for that child. When you talk about adoption, right, you have to go through an extensive vetting process to make sure that everybody's only concern is the well-being of that child,
Yeah.
right? We understand this from all sorts of different perspectives. When CPS or DPS, whoever you have, has to forcibly remove a child from the home, right, and put them into foster care, the ideal result is always putting the child back with the biological parents. It doesn't always work that way, and that's a whole nother conversation for another time, I guess. But I just don't understand how you can make the argument that nobody cares about the child in this scenario. I think you could argue that nobody cares about the carrier mother, surrogate mother, however, whatever you want to say that. I think you could say that nobody, necessarily cares about how it gets done necessarily. But to say that nobody cares about the child, that's in question. To me, just seems like it falls short in a lot of areas.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot that goes into just having a match for
Absolutely.
these people. So, um, again, we have a mutual friend who's done this. I
Yeah.
have a close family member who's looked into doing this. They're
Right.
not going to do it for various reasons, but
Right.
have looked into doing this. And the conversation, like, you have a couple who wants to have a child via surrogacy. I mean, it's not just you go online and you pick a name and then sign some
Yeah.
papers and you do it. I mean, you have interviews with each other, you meet with therapists together, you meet with medical professionals, with doctors together, you go through the ringer, and it is, let's see, what did she tell me? It is like at least a year to 18 months to 2 year process
Sure.
just to get everything in line to do the surrogacy,
Yeah.
and you're paying fees constantly over and over and over again. Like, this is one of the most heavily regulated reproductive um,
Yeah.
systems in the
Yeah.
world.
Which and there's a group out there that's freaking out because of how medically regulated it is.
Well,
But
sure, yeah,
the argument you can't make is that nobody's concerned for the child.
absolutely,
um, because from beginning to end, that's the only concern generally anybody has. So, Josh, we'll do this. We'll follow up her worst argument with, I believe, her best. And quite frankly, if you're looking at this from a moral, ethical perspective, Christian perspective,
hmm,
I think it's the only argument that has any traction whatsoever.
yeah,
And I do think it applies to most surrogacy cases, not necessarily all. But she says the end all be all thing, and this is really her big crux of the issue, right? I think, and I don't want to, I'm not necessarily wanting to put words in her mouth. However, I do think that she hides behind a little bit of the trauma. I think she hides behind the well being of the child because at the end of the day, she views surrogacy as a selfish act,
yeah,
right? It's a mom who wants to have a baby, so she uses another woman to get her that.
yeah,
Now, I think that surrogacy, and I will probably get heat for this, and I told you this before the podcast. I think that surrogacy, in and of itself, more times than not, has a selfish undertone to it.
mm,
Do I think that it is always an inherently selfish act? No. But I do think that there are inherently selfish undertones to the act of surrogacy, especially when you get into the realm of kind of like the Kardashians, right? Who she wanted a baby, she wanted the baby to be hers, but she didn't want to have it. And so she found somebody who would carry it for her.
yeah.
That's selfish. Okay. If I mean, that's just one of those things that to me now, the argument against that would be, well, how is it selfish? I want to have a baby. They want to be a surrogate. I'm willing to pay them a pretty hefty price to carry my baby for me. Who's losing in all this? Right. So, I mean, that would be the argument, I guess, against the selfishness.
Well, there's a everyone's motives is going to be different because motives are individual.
100%.
So for someone, and I don't know the situation with the Kardashian woman. Like,
I'd be,
I barely know who she is in the first
I
place.
was, I was going to be surprised if you could name more than one Kardashian anyway, Joshua.
Yeah, uh, I can't. but but if you don't want to get pregnant because, let's just say what it is. When a woman gets pregnant, it does things to your body, and your body will never be the same after that. At least in most cases, it's going to, and for these people who are so focused on beauty, looks, and the external, and that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But at least from my perspective, that's what they're focused on. If she doesn't want to have a baby because it's going to impact her body to where it's not going to be her definition of beauty
Sure.
or pretty or whatever, then
You
yes, I
probably
think that
ought
is
not
a
be a parent.
do what now?
Sorry, I was gonna say you probably ought not be a parent in that scenario.
No,
If
I
you're
just
more concerned, well, okay. I would argue, and I don't mean to like derail you here, Joshua, but I would argue that if you're more concerned with your own personal appearance, right? Because let's call it what it is, it's vanity. If you're more
sure.
concerned with vanity as opposed to parenting,
Yep.
then now again, I know people will probably argue, well, it's not that you're, it's wanting the best of both worlds, right? It's not being vain as opposed to wanting to be a parent. It's wanting to be a parent and take care of yourself, whatever the case may be. But I would argue that if you're more concerned with your own personal vanity than you are with being a parent, then you have a lot bigger issues than just the selfish motives behind the way you bring a child into the world.
Yeah. So my issue though is, and again, I don't know her situation, I don't know her story,
Sure.
but if you're perfectly capable and healthy and capable of carrying a baby to term, and that's not, aside from it maybe making your body look different, yeah, I don't see the need for a surrogate.
Yeah.
However, I'm not entirely convinced that it's always selfish, because there might be
Yeah. No,
a
I'm not.
couple who cannot physically have their own biological children who can use a surrogate to have a biological child.
Sure.
And this is where I come down, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it, because
Right.
I might look at them and say, well, from my perspective, God is sovereign over our lives, and God may have put on your life to be childless, and He may have put on your life to adopt.
Sure.
Why go out of your way to have a biological child when you could do these other things and help another child?
Absolutely.
But I think that rests with the couple themselves, with prayer and meditation on the word, and really thinking about it and thinking about it together. And that I'm not going to go up to a couple who's done that and be like, you know what, you should have adopted. You're wrong
Right.
and you're
No, I get
sinful.
that.
Like, I'm not going to do that.
Well, no, I get where you're coming from too, because like I said, as much as, and again, I've said this, I'll stick to it. As much as I do agree that there are selfish undertones to surrogacy in a lot of cases, I don't think that every case of surrogacy is a selfish thing. Okay, I want to make
But
that abundantly.
is there any sense in which you want a child that isn't in some sense selfish?
Well, okay, if you're
Is
going to
there
look
ever
at
a
it,
self, like, do you see
yeah,
what I'm saying?
if you're gonna view it as your personal desire to have children, um, if you're going to deem that as selfish, then yeah, having children, period, is selfish, right?
Yeah.
Now, I could argue the other way, right? I could argue the other way that not having children is selfish,
Hmm.
in the sense of, look, I mean this solely. So before anybody takes what I said and twist it way out of context, right? I'm not talking about those who are medically unable to have children,
Right.
right? If you don't feel like you can't adopt, if you don't think you can afford to adopt, and you biologically cannot have children, I'm not calling you selfish people.
Hmm.
But if your only argument against having children is, well, I don't want to because I like my lifestyle the way that I like my lifestyle,
Hmm.
some people would argue and say, well, then, yeah, if that's how you're going to be, you probably shouldn't have a kid because you're going to learn to resent that kid. You're going to want to do things that kid is not going to allow you to do. But I think that you have to call that what it is. I'm not saying it's necessarily sinful, but I think it would be selfish
Yeah.
for
Well,
you to say, I don't want
so
to. Now, if
but the spectrum goes both ways.
exactly,
So if you get married and you're like, well, I want to have children because I want my legacy to pass on, and I want the joys of
sure,
fatherhood and motherhood and all that, it's still the I want. It might be a very
sure,
justified and righteous I want, but it's an I want. And the same is true for childlessness. If you want to say, well, I don't want to have children because I like my lifestyle, and
yeah,
I don't want to do this, that, or the other. Well, that's still an I want. It's not necessarily a sinful I want, but it's an I want. And
sure.
so I think the selfish argument goes both ways, though. That's my
It has
point.
to, right?
Yeah.
And when it has to, right? Again, it becomes motives. It becomes about And again, you and I have talked about this. When it comes to God's calling on your life, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people,
Sure.
especially in the religious world that we exist in. The
Hmm.
word calling sometimes even gets hijacked, right?
Yeah. Right.
But you've got this concept that says, I do believe that the Bible teaches that God's original plan was for man and woman to exist together in marriage
Right.
for the purposes of having children.
Yeah.
And so I think that when you're following that model, I don't know that you can go wrong up until all the what ifs, right? When
Mm.
you talk about, is it selfish because of vanity? Is it? I think it's selfish to undergo through surrogacy, IVF. If you're going to put yourself, so let's back up for a second here. If you want a biological child so badly that you're willing to put yourself under incredible financial stress because of it,
Mm.
I think that can be selfish.
Mm-hmm.
The average cost of surrogacy from beginning to end in the United States that generally is not covered by insurance is anywhere from $100 to $225,000
Right.
to go through
And very few
surrogacy.
of it is covered by insurance. Like virtually none of it is covered by insurance.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is a massive burden that you're willing to put on your family
Mm.
for the sake of now, adoption's not cheap, IVF, not cheap.
Right.
But that is a huge financial burden that you're willing to put on your family for the sake of having something to call yours.
Right.
Does that make sense? And it
Yeah.
goes back to that
Yeah.
biological aspect of it. So I don't think that every scenario is necessarily in a sinful word selfish, right?
Sure.
I think that we have that certain desire and that certain calling to be parents or to not be parents or whatever the case may be. But I think that that's something that it's very difficult as a Christian to sit back and go, nah, if you had a surrogate baby, you were just doing that for selfish reasons. And again, you and I both know that you can make the opposite argument, right? You
Mm.
talk about two people that can't have kids, a woman who's been told by a medical professional, if you get pregnant, it's going to be a really big danger to your life,
Right.
and so they want to have a surrogate carry that out. Now, I will say this. I will say this as far as the selfish thing goes. I don't know. All right, let me put it. I don't know what that yearning is, but I would like somebody to talk with me if anybody's willing to. By all means, just reach out. What is that urge that is so great to have a biological child that the other avenues, right? Because we've talked about a few other avenues, right? And I think
Sure.
that there are, for lack of a better word, I think there are better avenues to reach parenthood if you can't have children of your
Yeah.
own, than surrogacy.
Yeah.
Um,
I agree.
Generally speaking, if generally speaking, if in instances of um, medically not being able to have children, adoption is the first process because, like, for example, I had a close personal friend who they did ultrasounds on hers. She was 23, zero eggs, right? So you can't harvest and do surrogacy for something that's not there.
Sure.
Again, medical miracle, she ended up getting pregnant. She has her own biological child, but they were going to go through the process of adoption. And so I think sometimes surrogacy is not necessarily first off sought by those who physically can't have children.
Mm.
But I am curious as to what is it about having something. I hate using the term something or having a child, right? How great of an urge to have a biological child do you have to have before other avenues of gaining parenthood aren't viable options? Because they're cheaper, they're quicker, and quite frankly, they have in my opinion, they have a higher impact or a higher likelihood of having a greater impact on a child's life when you go through a process like adoption than surrogacy.
Yeah.
Does that
I,
make sense?
I agree with you, and I'm curious to that too. Um, I'm not a psychologist, but I think that there is something to wanting a piece of you
Sure.
to last into the next generation and then
Sure.
continuing on. Um,
Well,
to take
and
your
I get it.
argument, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No. Go. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, to take your argument a little further with the man and woman created, um, this may be one of the first times we disagree. I do not believe that God created woman for the purpose of only bearing children for her husband. Because,
No,
and the
I
reason I
believe that
say
woman
that,
was created to be a helper for her husband.
yeah, I don't even
In the
think,
original scheme of things, I just think that part of God's original design for man and woman, from I'll say from the fall on,
mm,
right?
mhm,
Because I don't know that they mention anything about whether or not they would have needed children, other than just continuing on down. If sin hadn't entered the equation, there would be a need for
right,
generations, right? So
right,
from the fall on, I think part of God's design for man and woman inside marriage was children.
no. See, I
That
disagree with that. And the reason is because when God says be fruitful and multiply, God creates humanity and tells them be fruitful and multiply, right? And then
sure,
if you take the view, which I think most Christians do, that Adam and Eve were that Adam was the only human at the time and then Eve came along later. The command to be fruitful and multiply preceded that, but they're not fruitful and multiply till after the fall.
yeah,
There is something sacred about the marriage relationship from an emotional standpoint.
sure,
And now, all of that to say, with the children argument and having something to pass on, when you get out of that and you start seeing, um, Genesis is full of barren women, right?
mhm,
Women who cannot have children at all, and
right,
it's only in the least possible circumstances that they do have children, and
right,
obviously that's God at work there.
sure,
But once you get out of that, it's not just having children; they have to have a male child,
yeah,
right? And well, there's something special to that because
yeah. No, I
power is
got
what
you.
carries on the legacy and what carries on the name and the patriarchal system that the world of the Bible was in. I think
Sure,
something about that has transferred into our day too. That having
yeah,
a child, male or female, is
yeah.
going to leave a legacy and last,
Sure,
right?
I get that, and so I'll kind of continue on with that, because when I said I don't know, right, I don't get that biological connection. I mean that, and I don't, right. So it's one of those. I don't know what it's like to carry a child. I don't know what it's like to birth a child.
Sure.
I
Thank
don't
God.
necessarily. I never. Right. Well, so that's the whole thing, right? I never. When people ask me, and I genuinely to this day, I love my boys to death. But when people used to ask me, "Hey, do you want to have a boy or a girl?" I genuinely, at that moment, did not care.
Yeah.
I didn't care. I didn't care if it was a girl who would eventually, possibly lose my name, so to speak. Right? I
Right.
didn't care. I
Sure.
tell people all the time. I said, if it's a boy, there's just one less aisle at the grocery store that I have to worry about going down on a pretty regular basis. Right?
Sure.
That was the only concern that I had. But from a biological perspective, I'm not gonna lie, right? When people are like, "Oh man, Rhett is my youngest. He's got red hair, right?" And so they're like, "Oh, he looks just like you." I kind of like, it makes me a little happy when
Yeah.
people say
Sure.
that, right?
Sure.
And so I can understand in that regard why somebody wants something to kind of call their own, right? But I still hold very firmly to the idea that regardless of how that child came into your life, you can call it your own.
a
And
hundred
I think that
percent.
that's a phenomenal parallel. I'm not saying that because I'm using it, but I think that that's a phenomenal parallel to the way that we're viewed by God.
Yes.
Regardless of how you come to know Him, we are still viewed as His own. And the
Yeah.
Bible uses that language, right? The Bible uses that we are adopted, sons and daughters. And the Bible calls us to be and root our identity in Christ, not how we came into being.
Yeah. Absolutely. 100%. Couldn't agree more.
That's all I got, Joshua.
It's been a deep
I
conversation today.
felt like a good end cap there, but like I looked down, it's like I got no more notes, man. What's
No, I've enjoyed it, man. It's a deep conversation, and it's one
it
that
is.
can't be exhausted in an hour. But
Oh,
in all seriousness, to the listeners who are wanting to study more on this, you can find Scott Ray's book, Moral Choices, in its fourth
sure,
edition online. I think you can find a Google preview of it for free, and the chapter on surrogacy is very, very thought provoking. And
really.
and Scott Ray comes down in favor of surrogacy,
Yeah,
which I found very interesting. So read that, talk to people who've been through
sure.
it, and
And
obviously
that's
come
the
to your own
key, man.
conclusion.
That's the key. If this is a scenario that you're having to play out in your life, go talk to somebody who lived through it
Right.
and figure out why they came to the decision that they came to.
And nine times out of ten, at least in my experience, the
Yeah,
people who have been through it are really excited to talk about it.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think part of that is it's a topic that doesn't get talked about enough because,
Right.
again, kind of the way we started this, this is a topic that it doesn't affect, I would say it doesn't affect most people.
Sure.
And most people don't think about this till they absolutely have to.
Yeah.
So, but I love the comments. As always, guys, if you've got something that you want to hear us talk about, if there's a topic that comes up, there's a video clip that you see that's thought provoking, regardless of topic, right? And we can, talk about it here. We would love to do that. Come see us. Joshua's still in Murfreesboro. I see he's
Still.
still in the same
Yep.
office, right? Go see Joshua at Salem Creek Church of Christ, or you can come see me at the Troy Church of Christ. Um, man, I enjoyed this. I really do. I
Yeah, me too.
enjoyed this conversation. I think it's one that needs to be had. I think it's one that I think the more that people talk about it, the more normal it becomes.
Yep.
And I think it's something that clearly, Joshua, we've come down definitively on whether or not this surrogacy option is right for whoever's listening.
Yeah.
But it's just another one of those. It's a case by case basis, and so this is something that you've thought about doing for somebody. If this is something that you've considered, um, we said it. You can go back and listen to it. Are there other options? Sure. If this is the one that's right for you, does it make you a selfish, bad human being? Not necessarily.
Yeah. Just,
But
make
no,
sure to
it's
keep God in the focus and pray.
absolutely.
Pray over it. I mean, any life decision like that of that magnitude has to be wrapped in prayer.
Absolutely, 100%, always does, and will continue to be that way until we're long and gone at some point. So, but anyway, guys, until next time, we appreciated having you listen to us. Go Vols! I feel like I can't end this without saying that. Of course, if you listen to this on Sunday and they've lost to Virginia, I'll be much more depressed than I was when I recorded this. Lots of optimism going forward. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, until next
I'm
time,
ready to
guys.
be hurt again.
Always, man. Tennessee fan. 30 years of it that we're just or 30 for you, right?
Yeah, for me.
Almost 30 for me. So, but anyway, but guys, till next time, we will see you then.